guys. Block of clay. So I don't have any clay in my personal studio that's the same shape as what we have in class. But I think in the coil building video, I talked about if you wanted to start with a flat bottom on something, how basically you needed a flat piece of clay or a slab of clay. And one of the things, of course, is tossing down the clay and creating that flat surface, rolling it out with a rolling pin. I have a slab roller in my studio, which I'll show you in a little bit. But so, because I do a lot of slab work, and I want to have something that will roll out a lot of slabs. And then I still work, I don't just roll them out and use them like that. I tend to roll them out and do other stuff with it. But one of the things that can really help, so even in our clay tends to be in two sort of square-like chunks. Even there, you can like cut down the side of it, like the long side, rather than cutting a square off of it like you might do for coiling. So you can kind of try to cut it in as much of a slab as possible. And if you get it like relatively flat like that, and this is not perfectly even, like this side's a little bit thicker. Okay. And that. Do it so it goes the other way. So I'm trying to keep tossing it in slightly different directions so that it starts to even out. My one side was a little bit thicker, and now you can see that that side is a lot wider because it has actually spread out fairly evenly. And if that doesn't work for you at all, then just rolling pin it. And if you happen to have, these are way too thick, but if you had a couple of sticks that were the same thickness, which these are not, but if you had a couple of sticks that were the same thickness and were the right thickness, you could also put them on either side. Actually, they don't even have to be sticks. These are still too thick, but they could be pieces of wood. If you have anything around, they could be rulers if they're not too thin. You can roll on that until it evens out pretty much if you're really trying to get it to be a really nice even slab. But for the most part, I'm just gonna, no idea what that is, roll it by hand. I think kind of like rolling cookies. So just try to have equal pressure. And I do want to roll it, if I'm rolling pinning it, I want to roll it on both sides, because this is going to really push more on the top side. And I want to make sure that if I'm kind of pushing and compressing that clay, that I'm doing it on both sides. Otherwise, your clay sometimes will start to curl from being a little physically tighter on one side. So this isn't super thin. Let me see if I can go the other way a little bit. And this rolling pin is not great because it's got these edges, and my edges are showing up. But if I really have a lot of slab stuff to do, I definitely want to rolling pin it out until it's about the thickness that I need it. I will tell you that I usually will roll something a little thicker than I need it and let it firm up a little bit. And then if I need like a smaller piece, I'll cut off a piece that's about that size. It can be a little bigger than I need. It can also actually be a little bit smaller than I need, because this is going to be a lot easier to roll than this. So I can cut that piece off, go back in, and roll it a little bit more. You can see I put a little more pressure on, maybe you can't see. I put a little more pressure on this side than I did on this side, and it stretched it out more, and it started to curve the clay. So when I roll it this time, I'm going to intentionally put more pressure on the left side. I actually really like it when it does this. It's just so cool that you can straighten it back out by just doing that pressure. And now that's probably a thickness for me that I want. That's probably right around 3/16. It's between 1/4 inch and 1/8 of an inch. But you use whatever is comfortable for you. Okay, so a couple things about slab building. Slab building just refers to building things out of flat pieces of clay. It does not have to be anything in particular, just using those flat pieces of clay. So I can do things that are where I actually bend the clay a lot. I could drape this inside something else. I am going to say I really, my people that are at home, there are cup and bowl assignments for the end of the semester. Simple assignments, like in a lot of ways easier than what you're doing now, because there's not a lot there conceptually. Do not, and this will be in the instructions for those things, do not just drape a slab inside an existing plate or bowl or cup and use that shape as your design, because that is somebody else's design that you are stealing. And yeah, that's not you making something, that's you using something and copying their shape. So I don't really expect anybody to do that, but every once in a while somebody thinks that's a good idea. And it's a good idea maybe if you're like a home potter or hobby potter and you just want to make something that's similar to that shape, and hey, I have that shape, so I'll just use that. But there's not a lot of creativity in that, obviously. All right, so I'm going to roll this out just a little bit more. I can use just a regular size rolling pin, but I have my pony roller here, so I'm going to use it instead. So this is fairly leather hard, but it's still a little bit soft. So it's not going to hold its shape on its own. It will fall over if I'm holding onto it, but it is enough that if I curve it, that wall stays up pretty easily. And this is right around where I like to use it if I'm bending it around something. So I'm going to do like a miniature version. Basically, I'm going to make a little tiny cylinder. So one thing that I don't mind you using is something that's just round, like a tube or a ball, because that's not anybody's design. That is literally just a mathematical shape. So I'm going to pull this around here, pull this around. That piece of clay is not really big enough for this, but I'm not going to join it on here, I think. I'll just join it off of here. So if I had a longer piece of clay, I would actually pull it around, and when I'm joining it, and I'm going to join it, when I'm joining it, I would just join it on the tube and then try to cut it immediately off. Now, one of the reasons that I like to use a stiffer piece of clay too, one that's not super wet, is because most of your shrinkage on clay in the first several stages. So it shrinks while it's drying, and then it shrinks in the glaze firing. It doesn't really shrink in the first firing. We can get into that later, but basically most of the shrinkage at this stage, this is not going the way I wanted it to, most of the shrinkage at this stage happens between when it's plastic, which is when it's really bendable, and when it's leather hard, which is, this is getting to be leather hard. So if my slab is really soft and I join it and I leave it on here for any period of time, and this starts to wick the moisture out of it, it starts to shrink almost immediately. So besides the fact that it's wet and it wants to stick, it's also shrinking and it wants to stick. You never want to put clay on the outside of something and leave it on there to firm up, because it will get stuck. If you have a form that will let go of it, So like I sometimes will use like a kickball as a form, or like any sort of inflatable ball. And then I can actually leave my shape on there, and as my clay starts to firm, I start to let air out of the ball, and that works pretty well. Okay, so I'm gonna do this. So I'm not gonna unroll this, because if I'm bending the clay back and forth a lot, it's kind of like bending a wire back and forth, and it's gonna make it break. So I'm gonna scratch this up, scratch this up. This is why if this were longer, it's nice to do it on here, because then I've got a way to support it a little bit more. And my container of slip. You guys all, everybody that I prepped kits for this year, you all have containers of slip in your kit. Those little red lidded guys. So I'm gonna put this on here, slip that up, and I angled that cut so that I have more surface area going together. If I made it just straight, then literally the only area that's touching is the thickness of my clay. I have almost twice of that because of the angle that I cut this at. So I'm gonna go ahead and push these together. And if I could find something smaller, that's a tube-like thing. Even this will help. Yeah, even this will help. So give myself something to push against. That's still curved. So join that, blend this together. Oh. Let that firm. I'm going to let that kind of sit and set for a bit, because it's going to allow that stuff to gel together before I fuss with it too much. But then basically I could fill that in a little bit more. I could roll a little coil and lay it on there and blend it in a little bit more. If I wanted to cut a bottom for this, I would use the same hardness of clay, because again, clay shrinks as it dries. So I want to use something that's about the same moisture level. And I could just set this on it and trace it to get a bottom on this if I were making just a tiny cup. If I didn't like the fact that that edge were uneven, once it's a little firmer, I would cut that off, and I would check it and blend it and that kind of thing. So it's just really simple, like 101 softer slab or soft slab building. Pretty simple. Or I could just freehand bend it, right? I could just bend it, get the shape that I want, depending on what I wanted to do. So this one I think is a little bit firmer. So this guy holds its shape. Now, granted, if I lean this over a lot, it's going to start to bend, because gravity is a thing. It's not dry. It's just really, really firm. But I can still cut it. So I'm not even using a knife. I'm using a really, really flexible needle tool. So I want you to see that this still isn't really hard. It's hard, but it's not really hard, if that makes sense. It's still cuttable. I can still easily push a fingernail into it. I just can't dent it right away. So if I push on it with my finger, I'm not leaving finger marks. I can't really pinch it very easily even. If I push really, really hard, I can dent it. You can see a little bit on there, but not easily. So that allows me to make really, really clean cuts. And now I am looking for my knife. There it is. Knife. Sorry, you don't need this in there. Because the knife's going to work a little bit better. And this stick is no longer straight. Okay. I was looking at my cut and going, that's not quite straight. It's okay, but not. So make sure your tools are clean. Apparently I missed some clay when I cleaned that off last time. And if I drag that through it, that dry clay that's stuck on that blade is going to drag and pull and nick my clay on the way through. Okay, so I'm going to make a box just to simplify things. I make a lot of things out of slabs, honestly. I really wish I had brought one of my sculptural pieces into my studio to show you, but those are still at home because I haven't built shelves for those yet. But let me pull some things over here. A little cup here, a little handmade cup. I made these little fortune cookies out of clay because I was just playing in here. So there's a signature, never got cleaned on this. So I make these little kind of like whiskey cups. So you can see that I go ahead and I let that show. There's some texture on this, which I'll show you how to do in just a minute before I forget. This clay is a little bit firm for that. I probably should have done it a little bit sooner, but I can do it on the softer stuff and show you. But basically the same way that I did this, except I did join it on a tube. But here I'm going to show you, this was made on this tube, and there's no way that fits on there now because it shrunk a bit. Not a lot, but enough that there's no way that fits around the outside of this anymore. And it's pretty round, so it's not just that it didn't stay round. It's that it does not make it in there. All right, so cup, I have a mug, and I do have a box over here. So my little box, my little fox on top. So he's my knob, but this is dry clay. It's not fired yet, so I don't dare lift him by that, because when your clay is dry, it's really, really brittle. So once it's fired, it'll be strong enough to pick it up. So you can see if I'm making a container that I actually want to use as a reusable container, and I want to put a lid on something, I need to have some sort of edge, some sort of lip on that to keep the lid on. The lid has to sit on something. It can't just sit on top and it can be expected to stay there. Something has to keep it from sliding back and forth. But I'm going to just show you how to make a basic box. And then texture is pretty easy actually. So texture, I'll use this softer piece. I can roll in before my clay gets really, really firm. So the texture on this guy, right? This was some stuff that I got somewhere. And honestly, I don't remember where, but it's like under carpet cloth or like a bigger version of the stuff that goes on the bottoms of drawers sometimes. But it's a carpet underlayment most likely. And I can just roll that on and then it picks up that texture. Or this guy, my cool little honey dipper, boom, that. I would want to do this first before cutting my sizes because this is going to stretch out my clay. Each one of those stretched that piece out quite a bit. So I don't want to wait and do it after I've cut stuff to size. So I'm going to put that away. And like I said, I think this clay is too firm at this point to do anything with it, but I'll see if it will. Barely. That's going to get covered with glaze pretty easily. So we're going to just keep going. All right. So slab building. If I want to slab build. So that edge is nice and straight. So now I'm going to grab this ruler. So a board would work, a stick. I can measure, obviously. I can also use a piece of paper that I've cut to a certain thickness. So I could take my piece of paper, like fold it and cut it where I know that this is even from this end to this end, and use that as a template. Because I have this guy handy, I'm going to use it. I'm just going to cut it the thickness of this, right? This, and then the next one. So I'm going to make a tiny box just to show you guys how to make something with a slab if you want to have a more geometric form. But I kind of want to do something kind of quick. All right, So, actually, I don't want to cut that yet. I want to do this. I almost stabbed myself with my own knife. That would have been nasty. All right. So now I want to make 4 sides. I can, if I wanted my box to be perfectly square, then I can make them all the same size. I'll do them all the same size and I'll show you. I can either make them all the same size and overlap them in a way that keeps that equidistant, right? Or I can do the math and figure out if I make, I do want to make sure this is square. I meant to give you guys all one of these, but I don't know if I had enough because I don't think I did. So I do want to make sure it's square. So anything that you have, like a piece of paper that you know is square, I could have used the edge of this actually and just use the end of my ruler. Except I want to use this to measure. So it doesn't really matter what size it is. I just want to make sure it's the same. So this is still a little bit easier for me. And this, I'm going to cut my first piece, and as long as I'm sure that it's square, and again, I can always cut a piece of paper that's this size and use it as a template for cutting my pieces. I will say, if you want to be economically frugal with your slabs because you spend a lot of time rolling them out, right? Don't start cutting from the middle. I always get rid of like my rough edge first. Like if I was cutting a lot of straight things, I would take a straight edge and cut that bit off because that's not going to help me at all. I don't want to spend time trying to fix that. And then start cutting from the edge because otherwise you're going to use most of your clay and you're going to have all this outer stuff that doesn't get used. And why? All right, so I'm going to cut these. I'm going to cut 2 of these the same size. Now, if I wanted to make a square box, and my advice is just don't make a square box. But if I wanted to make a square box and I didn't want to overlap them, then I would need to do the math. So I would need to figure out if these are my short sides, like if my other pieces are overlapping this way, end to end, then I need to figure out how much longer I need to make that. So it actually needs to be, and that is not actually long enough to make a square. So start on another piece. So it would need to be this length. So I'm just going to mark it with my pencil. I'm just going to quick little line, and then plus 2 thicknesses of this line, and then I'm still going to use my straight edge. I'm going to go ahead and do 2 of these. And once I've measured 1, that should be the right size for my other one. Make sure I can see my line. I know this is tedious, but it's important if you're trying to do really exact measurements, then I want to do this. So if you were making a box, but you're probably not going to be making a box for the nature piece, but you never know. You might be making a box. So these 2, specifically if I was making a square box, plus that. This is if I want the outside to be square, obviously. The inside will be too. That. So that should be perfectly square. So on the longer ones, because they're the ones that are overlapping, this is the area that I'm going to score, this side on the end. And that's going to be the same for both of them. I'm going to dig a bit. I just did a workshop, an online workshop for handle making because I wanted to see if they had any tricks that I didn't know. And one thing that was interesting is how she scored and slipped. And if I can find the tool that she used, because I do have one somewhere. It's kind of a fun, easy way to do it. But we don't have that tool right now. It's just it's like a little wire brush thing that I've never understood why it existed, but the way that they used it made sense. I don't think that's its intended purpose, but it worked really well. All right, so I'm gonna goop up my ends with my slip. And this slip is really thick. I usually like my slip a little bit thinner, but you know, sometimes it sits for a while and it gets a little thicker. And I would always rather have a little too much slip on than not have enough on there. I want it to fill up my gaps from scoring. I want it to get in those grooves. I want it to soften that surface really well, but also I kind of want it to squish out a little bit. That's my shortcut. So actually the way she does things, the quicker way may not be quicker for me because it will require some additional work later. All right, so now here's this edge, and I'm butting this edge down. And I always go just a little bit on the inside. I want a lot on the inside, which I don't want to do. A little bit on the inside. I'm going to do this other one the same way. I probably have way more slip than I need. I got a little carried away with trying to exaggerate it so you could see. But I do want it to kind of squish out because the slip tends to shrink as it dries. It's going from super, super plastic, right, super wet, to really firm. And it tends to kind of get sucked in as it shrinks. And I don't want to have a gap. All right, so I'm going to press these together. And I'm going to let it overlap just a hair. And I'm going to tell you why. Because it's a lot easier to cut that edge off and clean it up later than it is to try to fill it in. You know what? I'll make one that's wrong on purpose. And I left extra clay, and it's not big enough. All right, well, anyway, that's the idea. I'm going to let this set up, sorry. I do want to make sure this is height-wise all good, good, good. I can actually kind of squish these. What's the advantage of having it butted on either end is I can kind of like squish them towards each other, right? So I've got a lot of slip oozing out. I'm going to let it firm up though, and I'm going to let you see what that looks like, and then I'm going to show you after it firms up, like how to clean up that slip. And I'm going to say that you don't have to make a box, obviously. I can cut these at an angle and attach them at an angle, so I could do some fun stuff like this. And I will make sure that I take some images of my sculptures that I have at home, or I have images of some of my sculptures. I'll make sure I attach those so you guys can see like some of the possibilities with slabs. Yeah, so like I could do like this and flip that. And I've got this shape. But a nice, nice clean edge. Like if my clay is nice and firm, I've got a nice edge with that. So I'm going to join that the same way, but I'll join it off camera so you can see it after it firms up. All right, guys, so these have been sitting for a little while. And you can see, so this is the one that I did where I just made it, like I tried to make it kind of even. So I'm going to go ahead and, at that point, that slip is pretty firm, and I'm going to clean that up. But see now, I don't know if you can see, this edge looks pretty good. But if I look at this edge, I don't know if you can tell, it kind of dips down a little bit. And so ideally, I would have to like fill that in to make it a nice clean corner, which is probably what I'm going for if I'm bothering to build something out of a hard slab, you know, a firm leather hard. And so now I've got to patch that and cut it back, and at this point this isn't going to slide very well. it's attached pretty well, so that's not really going to work. So it's a lot easier to trim the excess off than it is to fill that in. All right, so I have some slip on the inside here that is firmed up quite a bit, but is still a little bit soft. And I'm just gonna push that in. I'm using the back of my fingernail, but I can also just use a sponge. I'm gonna use a sponge to see if I can get rid of my score marks that I made that I don't really want there. So I blended that in. It's a nice, smooth transition. It's not too sharp. You know, it's just nice and clean looking. All right, so this stuff. So again, it kind of, if you can see it, you can see it's gooped up in the middle. I can also use a stiff brush. Let's see, worried I didn't have any. So like the ones that you use for oil paint that are a little bit stiffer, they're like a firm bristle brush. They don't have to be expensive because you're just going to use it. That actually makes a really nice smoothing tool too. Or the rounded end of something, like if you can't get your fingers in there okay, but blending that makes it look really, really clean. I actually like the end of this better than I like the brush. So that, I'm still leaving a little bit of roughness. I want to go a little bit easy. An eraser makes a good blending tool, honestly. Let me clean this off a little bit first because I've obviously used this already. And this is not a very soft eraser. These are really crappy pencils. But that can be really awesome because it's a little bit soft too for blending the inside. And I would kind of check it with my finger. And then I would probably almost always go in a little bit with a sponge. I don't want to use the sponge too much because I will end up re-softening my piece. Now, if I don't have a lot of slip in there and my edges need reinforcement, so like this looks pretty good, but let's say I made like a really, really big box and I'm worried that that's not enough to kind of hold it. Then, I'll steal some off my, then I might roll a coil, like a skinny coil, and I could score and slip, but most likely what I'll do is I'll go in with a sponge and get it a little bit sticky. I'll put a coil in there, and I'll reinforce it with that coil, push it in, blend it, back of my fingernail, eraser, whatever is working, and then sponge it until it transitions nicely. So ideally, I would keep working at that a little bit more until that really, really blended in, because I don't want it to be really obvious that I shoved another piece of clay in there. I just want it to look clean. So that now, that corner is seriously reinforced. It's a lot thicker, and it's going to be stronger, because this is always going to be the weak point in a piece, and a corner is always a weak point anyway, so structurally. All right, so this is nice and firm at this point, and so I just go in. If you have an old X-Acto knife, those work really well for this too, or the fettling knives, which are your longer knives with the wooden handle that are in your toolkits. Any kind of sharp knife. I actually, at home sometimes, when I can't find my appropriate clay tools, I have a really small paring knife that I will use for this because it's such a natural movement to do it with a paring knife. If I'm nervous about coming down too far with the knife and cutting into it, which I will admit I have done, then I'll get it kind of close, but not all the way. And then instead of cutting with it, I can scrape with it. Right? I don't have to cut with it every time. I can scrape it down. Now, if I have cool texture on there, that can be problematic because I'm going to be scraping my texture off. That usually just requires a little more care in terms of joining and cutting rather than scraping. All right, so do the same thing with my other two sides. So I had determined, I know, there's still some cleanup that needs to happen. This is not really big enough for this because I got that circle out of it. So even if I put it at the widest point, my bottom doesn't quite come up to that. So I set some pieces of clay aside to firm up so that they're similar in firmness. I have a wedging area over here that's off camera that's the same concrete board that we use in class. And then this is similar plywood to what we have in class, just so you know. So this one I cut to about the same size, but I was really nervous that it was going to shrink more than what I had allowed for. And it seems fine. I always want it to be about the same hardness. So one of the things that you have to be aware of if you're building shapes with clay out of slabs, but you're joining clay to clay in a way that is structural, I guess is a good word for it. That shrinkage is really, really important in figuring this out, because if this clay hasn't already shrunk the same amount, like it's softer, and it's a little bit softer, but I think it's firm enough. We'll find out. If it's a lot softer, then this is already shrunk, but this will not have shrunk yet. So when I attach it and it shrinks, it's either going to crack or it's going to warp and pull this whole thing out of shape with it. And then there's a chance that, like, basically if this were firmer and it had shrunk already, and I attach this to it, and this were softer and it hadn't shrunk the same amount yet, then when this tries to shrink, it's going to crack apart at the corners, and that is something I definitely don't want. So this actually ends up being a really good size. It's just a hair over, which I like, because again, a lot easier to trim it off than it is to fill it back in. So I would just literally trace my piece. So if my piece were bigger, like if my bottom were bigger than this, then I would trace all the way around, right? But I'm going to cut, again, always easier to trim extra off. So I'm going to cut it just on the outside of the line. So this one's right on the line. See, I did that. I cut it right in the middle of the piece because that's what we want to do as human beings. And now these two things are practically unusable. Of course, I already know that I'm not using these right now, so that's part of it. Boom. All right, so this is a little bit bigger. My line is right here, and my cut is right here. And it's like a little bit over 1/16 of an inch. It's not a lot, but it gives me a little bit of cushion should I be off. So I would score and slip this, score, slip, join that together if I'm making a box, right? Same thing, extra slip so it oozes out on the inside, and then I can blend that, or if I doesn't like stick out enough, or I end up seeing like actual cracks, like space where that is, then I would sponge it and fill it in with a small coil. If I wanted to make a box with a fitted lid, then I would do the same thing on top. If I wanted to just make a solid rectangle looking thing, then rectangle on top, rectangle on bottom, and then I would take either my needle tool, so let's pretend like this is together and it's solid, so we'll do it like this. Boom. Pretend like that's all joined and solid. Then I would want to either with a needle tool, or you could actually literally take a pin or a sewing needle. This is a nice skinny one, so it works pretty well. And I need to poke a hole in it somewhere. So if I were like making a piece that was assembled out of these rectangles, like now that I've made the rectangles, I can then score and slip those together and have something kind of cool going on. I would want to put this where maybe it couldn't be seen very easily. But you need to let the air out. So one, again, the drying time, the moisture gets trapped inside there. And two, it's still going to shrink some more. So I've got air trapped inside, and it's getting tighter and tighter and tighter on that air, and it might actually pop one of the seams out. I make hollow things all the time, and sometimes when you poke a hole in them to start cutting it open a little bit again, because usually I do open them back up, you'll actually hear hissing from the air, like escaping. And sometimes it's really bad. Like you're like, oh God, that was really close. That was kind of terrifying. Not that it was gonna like blow up in my face, but it definitely almost self-destructed. Okay, let me do this. So I have, I'm gonna go ahead and do that one. A container, like this is just a cheap Target food storage container that I'm using for my scraps, so my little scraps, right? So that I'm not just automatically recycling these. I might want these for something later. So I'm gonna put those in there until I get too many, and then I have to like edit out the ones I wanna keep and the ones I don't. Okay, so I joined this. You can see the slip on the inside. Boom, right? So this is our funky one. And I'm gonna rub that together and clean it up. Now, I can leave it be kind of a softer edge, or again, that kind of I had extra there. I can scrape it or cut it down. If you know what a Sureform shaver is, it's like one of those hardware rasps, which is like a really, really hardcore grater. It's made for grating wood, basically. Those can be really nice for shaving down the edges of a clay form. It's going to leave some texture, so you still have to smooth it afterwards. But if you have one, those work great. I'm going to clean that up a bit. So boom. So I often will make geometric sculptural forms out of clay, and I will start building these shapes, and then I'll start assembling them together. So this is like the beginning of something, possibly. So, but it doesn't have to be a box, right? It can be whatever comes together. I also don't have to make an edge. Like I could attach this piece onto this piece right in the middle of it. Obviously, I would want to have something in mind for that. Like this does, I'm not doing this because I have no purpose for this right now. This makes no sense to me. But I have attached things in the middle of things before, but not like right now. That's not striking me as anywhere that I want to go in the moment. All right, so that's our slab stuff. That's our basic slab demo. And then we did have a question come up from a couple different people about how long do you let stuff sit before it's firm enough for where you want it to be? And the problem with that, the answer for that is that it's different for every single situation. It's different depending on, do you have it sitting on something that is porous versus non-porous? Are you in a space that is humid or not humid? Is there airflow? Because airflow will make it dry out faster. So it can literally be the difference between hours and days. So I teach sometimes at the Canton Museum as well. They're not having classes right now, and honestly, I had already told them that with being at two different schools, I didn't feel comfortable coming in there because it's just too much contact in too many different places. But very often that room can be either really humid or really dry. So sometimes you'll wrap stuff up and you'll wrap it kind of loosely, and then next week it'll be too firm. And then other times you'll wrap stuff up and you'll wrap it up exactly the same way, and like 3 weeks later, it's still too wet to work with. And it's really frustrating. And that's the same space. So to give you like an exact answer on that, there is no exact answer on that. My suggestion is if you're working from home, especially, to set something out and set yourself a timer on your phone, and start with every half an hour, check on it, or 20 minutes. And then if that seems like it's really not firming up quickly at all, then maybe you do every hour that you check on it. Or maybe you set it outside and then you make your timer a lot faster, and you make sure you keep an eye out for rain, because that is the enemy of clay sitting outside. But yeah, there's no right answer for that at all. So I'm gonna hang up on this for now, and then, yeah, slabs. So you may not use them at all for the nature project, but I want you to have that capability. So I've got two cameras going here. I want you to have that capability because it's important to know how to do this. And it might be something you don't use for the nature, but it might be something that you use for the narrative metaphor project. Right. Peace out.